This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello.
So we're going right from one end, the House of Lords end of Parliament, to the other.
What does all this mean? Sources close to the Prime Minister? Number 10 believes that? The Labour leader will say that. How do they know?
We're picking our way through to the press gallery in the BBC office.
In today's feedback, we're going to go behind the scenes in Parliament and try and break that political code with the help of Radio 4's chief political correspondent, Ben Wright.
The currency of this job is gossip and information, and extracting that information is key to doing the job properly.
Also this week, at a time when the BBC has lots of digital channels, what is cricket still doing on Radio 4 Longwave, and why is it always men playing it?
I noticed that the BBC broadcast the men's final on both Radio 4 Longwave and Radio 5 Sports Extra, whereas the women's final was only broadcast on the digital station. I think it's these sorts of small decisions about where to cover women's sport that collectively add up to the disproportionate coverage.
Listener Claire Martin. And broadcasting has a new cult phenomenon, courtesy of this programme.
And now the chicken forecast issued by the Vet Office on behalf of the Egg Timer and Toastal Agency at 0400 hours today.
Apparently the outlook for the next 24 hours is foul. But we begin with politics. The way the BBC reports on the goings-on at Whitehall and Westminster form the basis of a great proportion of our postbag. Here are just a few of the questions you've sent us.
My name's Barry Ruffle. I'm from Shoreham in Sussex. My point is about the free release of politicians' speeches, which are then taken up by news programmes and presented as news items ahead of the speech itself. Seems odd to me that that's regarded as news rather than publicity.
Hello, I'm Jane Creasy and I'm calling from Penn in the Chilterns. Many of the stories that we've had have been about financial troubles, and there's a strong overlap between the political implications and the financial ones. And I wonder how the journalists decide who's going to cover what. I suppose I'm really interested in, is there some kind of rivalry?
The BBC's Westminster operation has its office in Millbank, just opposite the Houses of Parliament. There's a team of 12 political correspondents, plus other journalists, producers and technical staff, who provide political news for all the BBC's networks and digital services. The site used to be occupied by Millbank Prison, which contained a treadmill, inside which inmates walked round and round in circles without getting anywhere. Do the journalists who inhabit it today have a more fruitful occupation? On Wednesday this week, armed with your questions, I joined this network's chief political correspondent, Ben Wright, for the 9:30am planning meeting.
Good morning, everybody. Just welcome our team from Feedback here, doing a day in the life of Ben Wright. So 20-second package. Fine, OK, let's talk through the agenda for today. First of all, Prime Minister's question time, which is at noon. Presumably there's two things we know about they may talk about.
Well, this is the first meeting of the day where the news editor, John Whitney, will get everyone together, so all the political correspondents, the producers, people from the various political programmes, and talk about the stories that are likely to dominate the day, how we're going to cover them, who's going to do what.
And this is where you demonstrate your sharp elbows by getting the best stories, do you?
Yes, exactly.
Norman, can you just talk? You've been doing some live on the news channel this morning about
the jobless figures are a good story.
Yeah, the jobless figures. You've got two things to say: jobless figures and anything.
Well, Ben, what's the result of that meeting for you? Did you decide there what you're doing?
It's a funny day because there isn't a standout lead political story at the moment. We're waiting in many ways for Prime Minister's question time at 12. The confrontation there may produce an obvious story for later on. The unemployment figures could well be the lead political story of the day, and I think it will become clearer in the next hour or two what the main story will be. But my next job is to speak to the programme, speak to editors, get a sense of what else is in their running order, because obviously I am competing with all sorts of other stories and other correspondents from around the world wanting to get themselves into running orders. I, as the chief political correspondent for Radio 4, will do the main political story of the day.
But the stories are political, but they're also falling into the area of specialist, economic, business. So listener Jane Creasy says often there is an overlap in the stories of the day. Is there a strong rivalry between the political, say, and the financial journalists?
I'm not sure rivalry is the right word. There is a constant discussion between the different units and departments of BBC News. And there is very often a fairly neat division. For instance, on the unemployment story today, the business unit, I think, are going to be taking the lead in terms of the numbers, where unemployment's falling, where it is not falling, what's responsible for this fall. We and I will do the political dimension, because clearly there is a huge political strand to this story.
What happens when the BBC is the story? I mean, for example, next week you'll almost certainly be planning coverage of the Director General George Entwistle's appearance before a House of Commons committee in the light of the Savile allegations. Now, a lot of your competitors will be looking to see whether someone is going to lean on you. Does anybody ever lean on you from the BBC when you're reporting the BBC?
Never. It has never happened to me, and there is, in my experience, no pressure at all to go soft on a BBC story. I would cite the BBC's coverage of the Hutton inquiry, for instance, a huge story with massive implications that I think we treated like any other major political story, even though the BBC was at the centre of it. I'm just going to have a word with Juliet Dwyer, who's editing today's World at One.
Because it's the first one after the conference season, the first PMQs.
A chunky package.
A chunky package, probably 3 to 3.5 minutes.
Fine.
With a sort of nice cross-section of contributions.
Sure.
And are you going over to the House to do it
Yeah,
today?
I think we will do it from... Andrew, yes, we'll do it from the Commons.
We'll do it from the Commons. It will mean we'll get it quite late, but we
always
do that. That's fine.
How much advance warning can you get on a story or a key speech? Because people like Barry Ruffles say, well, we often quite hear items on news programmes which begin, the Prime Minister is expected to say.
Politicians want to control the message, of course. They always have done. And I'm sure it has been the case for a long, long time that opposition parties and certainly the government pre-brief speeches.
You're playing by their agenda, aren't you? They're controlling the news rather than you.
No, I disagree. If I get some embargoed words of a speech that the Prime Minister or Ed Miliband is going to be making the following day, it is my job during the evening to work out whether there is any news value in what is going to be said. And then it is my job to probe it as well and to start phoning special advisors and asking them, you know, what is the guts of this announcement you're really making? I mean, it's not just a case that we're given a nibble of a story and then inevitably bite on it.
Ben, where are we off to now? We're leaving the building.
Yeah, we're making the short walk, familiar to most MPs, from the BBC's office in Millbank over to the Houses of Parliament.
We'll return to Ben a little later in the programme, when we'll put some more of your questions to him and listen in as he reports on Prime Minister's questions. The party leaders will offer him their carefully prepared sound bites. Will he swallow them? And will you be able to hear whether he does or not? Well, if you're one of those listeners who rely on longwave to hear Radio 4, chances are Ben's reporting might have been replaced until recently by this.
Plays a slog sweep very safely, and they take a drop! It's dropped, I think.
The sound of the World 2020 cricket tournaments, which have just finished. While they were taking place, they were broadcast for hours every day on Radio 4 longwave, displacing the normal Radio 4 schedule and greatly irritating many listeners who were certainly not cricket fans. But couldn't they switch to FM or listen online? Well, in some places, longwave is still all there is.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Clark, and I'm calling from Drumnadrochit, a little place in the mountains up above Loch Ness. My heartfelt plea is that cricket should be taken off longwave Radio 4, and this is because we simply cannot receive things like broadband, iPlayer, and not even FM. So we're very, very dependent upon the longwave signal that's been going forever. So I very much hope the BBC is listening to us living up in the Scottish Highlands.
Of course, some listeners love the cricket and will have been enjoying the longwave coverage. Unless they're fans of the women's game, that is.
Claire Martin, speaking from London. I noticed that the BBC broadcast the men's final in the Cricket 2020 World Cup on both Radio 4 Longwave and Radio 5 Sports Extra, whereas the women's final, which happened to feature the England women playing, was only broadcast on the digital station. I think it's these sorts of small decisions about where to cover women's sport that collectively add up to the disproportionate coverage of men's sport compared to women's sport.
I went to meet Radio 4's network manager, Dennis Nolan. I began by asking him about Jeremy Clark's situation, forced to listen on longwave because of where he lives. His only choice is to listen to the cricket or switch off.
I presume that because of the mountains, he's also finding it difficult to get DAB, though DAB coverage is also being rapidly extended to cover very nearly the whole of the population. So unless he has access to the internet, I'm afraid that he is going to be confronted with a lot of cricket on long wave. I can only apologise to him for the disruption to the Radio 4 schedules, and indeed to all listeners in his position who aren't cricket fans.
There is a solution, which is you take cricket off long wave, and people would say, well, hold on, what's 5 Live for? What's 5 Live Extra for? Surely the BBC can now put cricket on some station other than Radio 4.
There is not sufficient space on 5 Live and Sports Extra to carry all of the sporting commitments that the BBC's audience would like us to carry. Moreover, even if we were able to carry all of cricket on Sports Extra, we have a commitment to the audience and indeed to the English Cricket Board that we will make cricket available on an analogue service.
Well, you could say, of course, that this is the residue of a situation where most people in the establishment want their sport, i.e. cricket, on Radio 4. But surely times have changed now. There's no more logical argument for cricket on 4 than soccer on 4 than rugby union on 4. Why single out cricket for this unique honour of being on Radio 4?
We've done audience research recently which shows that a majority of the audience still associates cricket with Radio 4 long wave, and that's where they expect to find it. Now, there is a migration towards DAB, and people therefore increasingly able to find it on Sports Extra. But there's still a lot of people who expect to find it on Radio 4 long wave.
Well, if that expectation is there about cricket, what about listener Claire Martin's point that says if it's important to air the men's cricket on long wave, why not the women's? She says she's disappointed that the women's T20 cricket final, England versus Australia, wasn't on Radio 4 long wave when the men's final was, and that didn't involve England.
I'm sure it's true that the more coverage you give it, the more interest there will be in the game. And it would be nice to be able to give equal coverage to the women's game. It is nevertheless the case that at present there isn't such an ardent following for the women's game as there is for the men's game.
But that's partly because it doesn't get the attention, does it?
The BBC has to make decisions every day about things that it will cover and things that it won't, because we have a limited spectrum, limited number of services, limited airtime. At the moment, we're broadcasting cricket on about 70 days this year. 71 days this year we're broadcasting cricket on Radio 4 long wave. How many more letters would you be getting at feedback from disgruntled Radio 4 listeners who were being deprived of the wonderful schedule of drama and news and comedy and documentaries that Radio 4 wants to offer?
But if Jeremy Clark near Inverness, he's got to lump it anyway, because you're not giving him an option, and you could give him an option by taking sport, taking cricket in particular, off long wave and using it for the output that everybody in the rest of the country can get access to.
Well, as I say, there are difficult choices that we have to make the whole time between the needs of different parts of the audience. And I'm never going to make all your correspondents happy. That's one promise I can make you, Roger, now. All I can say is we make these decisions carefully and with due consideration of audience demand.
Dennis Nolan, Radio 4's network manager. Now, earlier this week, Radio 2 announced that, after 15 years in the job, veteran Mike Harding will no longer present the station's folk music show. Instead, the show will be presented by Mark Radcliffe, who currently has a late-night show on Radio 2, in addition to the 6 Music Afternoon programme he co-hosts with Stuart McConey. Mike Harding's last programme will be on Boxing Day. It's said that the bosses at Radio 2 want to give the show more of a live feel. Well, some of you are not pleased.
I'm Brian Morgan. It's said that maybe more live broadcasts are needed. Why wasn't more time given to Mike to bring in live broadcasts? He's been the voice of folk on BBC Radio for 15 years. Why cut him off now?
Malcolm Edge. I'm a fan of Mark Radcliffe, but I can't see how he's any better for the folk programme on Radio 2 than the current presenter. Mike Harding grew up in the folk scene and has kept up with it. His credentials are impeccable. So I'd welcome hearing from Radio 2 explaining the reason for the change and finding out exactly what they have in mind for Mike Harding in the future.
Radio 2 sent us this statement.
We very much hope to work with Mike again in the future, as he has done a fantastic job of supporting the genre and introducing Radio 2 listeners to a broad range of folk artists. However, this change will give us increased flexibility to support and reflect the wide variety of folk music available. Mark is a very experienced and accomplished live broadcaster, so it will enable us to broadcast the programme live when required and to incorporate folk music more seamlessly into our mainstream programmes.
Do please keep your views coming. Now, it's no surprise that many listeners love the lyrical, poetic rhythms of this shipping forecast, which often lulls them to sleep. Not, of course, the intention, but a pleasing result for many on dry land. From Dogger to Cromarty via German Bight, the forecast has become something of a national treasure. But now it has some serious competition. On last week's feedback, we featured the chicken forecast, and it has caused a bit of a stir. In case you missed it, here's a clip.
The general synopsis at breakfast time. Eggs lightly salted with slow-moving soldiers. Sponge cake and lemon meringue pie declining by dusk tonight.
Hi, this is Tess Barclay from Beaumer Heath in Shropshire, and I thought the chicken forecast that you played at the very end was absolutely lovely. I keep chickens myself, and I've always loved the shipping forecast, so it combined two of my pleasures.
My name is Fiona Quinn, and I'm calling from Frome, Somerset. I just wanted to say that I heard a bit of the chicken forecast and thought it was hysterically funny. People were coming and going, well, what are you laughing at? I was going, this chicken forecast, it's really brilliant, especially when she was talking about the bantams and the different types of chicken.
Belted bantam, booted bantam, bearded Danvers, laying steadily. Moderate or good, simmering 5 to 7 minutes.
Hi, I'm Doug from Hawley in Surrey, and I was thrilled to hear the beginnings, at least, of the chicken forecast. It seemed quite ironic to me that as the programme had previously been talking about dropouts, you chose to fade this quite wonderful piece of work at the end of the programme. Perhaps you could repeat it?
Just a small selection of your praise for the poultry parody. The chicken forecast is now available in full on the Feedback website. It was composed by listener Dinah Shaw. So what inspired her to write it, and what's her reaction to the excitement it's caused?
Oh, that's lovely. That's so nice. I'm thrilled to bits. I have 6 chickens of 3 different breeds. When I was looking through a book about chickens and looking at the index, looking at the different types of breeds, and as I was reading them, the rhythm of the names just brought to mind the shipping forecast and its poetry.
Well, Dinah, according to listener Liz Wright, the heady experience of appearing on Feedback could be just the beginning.
I edit Smallholder magazine, and I was amazed when I heard the chicken forecast. I'd love to put it in Smallholder magazine because I know that my readers, most of whom have poultry, would absolutely love it.
So what do you say, Dinah?
Oh, my goodness. Well, that would be very nice. I would be delighted.
The UK outlook for the next 24 hours. Remaining unsettled with bantams veering westerly to avoid the post van. Squally moment under the hedge with dog patches, possible later. Otherwise, much the same. And that completes the chicken bulletin.
Thanks to all of you who got in touch, and most, of course, to Dinah herself. As you can see, you can write to us about anything. The address is, of course, Feedback, P.O. Box 67234, London SE1P4AX, or you can leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk, and all those details are on our website. Now let's return to Chief Political Correspondent Ben Wright, who I shadowed on one of his busiest days, the Wednesday of Prime Minister's Question Time. Earlier we caught up with him at Millbank when he was sorting out his schedule for the day, and now we rejoin him as PMQs approach, and he enters into the thick of it, the House of Commons itself.
So we're going right from one end, the House of Lords end of Parliament, to the other. And we're picking our way through to the press gallery in the BBC office. Right, we've got a long slog up this staircase now.
Right, how many floors?
It's 4 or 5.
What's your agenda? How many things are you going to have to do today, you think, at this stage?
Well, I know that I've got a Prime Minister's Question Time package to do for the World at One. I also want to now, in the next sort of half an hour or so, nip over to Portcullis House, which is the newer office block for MPs, where a lot of the milling around and the gossiping happens between MPs and journalists. The currency of this job is gossip and information, and extracting that information is key to doing the job properly. But you need to protect the people who are giving you that information.
while not accepting everything they tell you as being the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to be on your guard.
One of our listeners, Simon Cole, asks, how do you react when interviewing someone whom you know is trying to sell you an untruth?
The number of times that you can have a discussion with an MP on the record, you're recording it, and then afterwards, when you've switched off, they tell you something completely different, happens with a frequency that you might be surprised by. And I would always then choose not to use them, to be honest, because I know that you would not be reporting fairly what they actually think.
Well, now we somehow miraculously come from this sort of Victorian Gothic building via subterranean passages to a very much 21st century building full of glass and steel. What can you find out here that you don't back in the House of Commons?
Well, the lobby of the House of Commons is traditionally where journalists go and have an off-the-record word with members of Parliament and pick up the gossip. This is a very good additional place to come and do that. And I'm going to grab this Tory MP here if I want a quick word. Hang on.
OK. We've got a question from listener Jane Creasy, and she says this. Without giving too much of the game away, could you give us a quick code-breaking lesson? Words and phrases to look out for example, a source close to the Prime Minister. Now, who's that?
It can mean a number of people. It is normally the political special advisor who speaks on their behalf to the press. So they're speaking with a greater freedom in terms of politics than the civil service can.
OK, how about number 10 thinks that?
That's normally the Prime Minister's official spokesman. I think to write it that hard and to say number 10 thinks that is somebody senior in his press team.
And finally, if you say I have it on the highest authority, that means if it concerns a cabinet minister or whatever, he's briefed you off the record.
Invariably, yes. You sometimes find yourself having rather peculiar conversations at the end of a chat about whatever issue you've phoned a minister or a cabinet minister to talk about, where you decide on the terms that this conversation took place and how on the record this quote can be. And sometimes a minister can say, well, you can't quote me directly, but you can say a spokesman for the minister says that.
So if I'm trying you will collude to a degree, in your view, to get
there is a negotiation, yes. But the aim is to get out the information.
Well, Ben appears to have finished his conversations with Conservative MPs for the moment. OK, Ben, I won't ask you who you were talking to, but what's the mood about Andrew Mitchell?
Well, at the moment, my sense is that if he survives this week, he'll be fine. It's going to be uncomfortable for him today. I think most Tory MPs seem resigned to that. He's going to get a real barracking at PMQs.
What are you going to do now?
I will cut it as fine as possible.
Right.
In terms of getting into the chamber. So I want at least another 10 minutes here trying to talk to MPs, and then I'll go and Bagsy a seat in the Commons.
All right. OK. Fine.
His tone was interesting. But the question is whether we start with Cameron explaining the figures, or we have Miliband's question.
It's 12:22. Prime Minister's questions are still going on, but Ben Wright has come back to the office, and they're now together with the producer working out what they should use. He'll have to do the links live, and then play in the clips live as well, so that doesn't give them a lot of time.
They also clashed over the cheap with Andrew Mitchell's recent outburst.
Watto may have already started and be on air, but one of its main elements is still being worked on. Ben Wright is still typing away, his producer is still editing. Now it's after 1 o'clock. They better get a move on.
20 seconds, OK.
And the affair may well come up at a meeting of Conservative backbenchers later on today. Our chief political correspondent Ben Wright was watching from the press gallery.
Martha, with the conferences over, the three main party leaders come back.
Can I ask now about language, which is of great interest to a lot of our listeners. Ian Wells, for example, says, I know politicians like to claim all their proposed changes will be reforms, but why don't political correspondents always use change? In other words, this is a change, the government hopes it will be a reform, but that's to be seen.
Well, I would say if you listen back to, I hope, most of my recent coverage, you will not find the word reform. It's one of those words I avoid like the plague for exactly that reason. I think it's loaded. I think it implies a positive development. I try wherever possible to say policy.
Similarly, another listener thinks the BBC has succumbed to Downing Street pressure. Let me quote the listener. Changing the word cuts, as in £10 billion of cuts, to £10 billion of savings.
It depends on the context that you're having this discussion in. I remember the Conservative Party conference when we were talking about the additional £16 billion that the government said it needs to save in its next comprehensive spending review. Because the government has not yet decided how it plans to squeeze the deficit, I don't think it was possible for us to say cuts. I think it's fair for us to say the government wanted to save £16 billion through a mixture of spending cuts and tax rises.
Talking to other MPs, do you think that they would want to slap Andrew Mitchell supportively or not on the arm?
Not a supportive slap, but I think there is support for Mr Mitchell, and perhaps more than there was at the Tory party conference.
Well, Ben, I noticed just before you went into the studio, your shirt tails were out, and as you came out of the studio, you blew your cheeks. Is that normal? Is that the way it usually goes?
No, that wasn't put on for you, Roger. That is how it is. I mean, with a turnaround that tight, it is fraught. Your clothes are starting to fall apart. You're getting rather flushed. I'm starting to shout at Andrew. It can't be anything but that.
And at the very end, I wonder if there's a hostage to fortune. You're asked by Martha Carney, in effect, whether Andrew Mitchell would survive. And you said, words to the effect, yes. You must now be hoping he does.
People want a judgment. That's not the same as an opinion. You know, rather than just saying, well, on the one hand, some Tory MPs are saying this, on the other, some Tory MPs are saying that. I think it's quite instructive and I think quite helpful for me to be as honest as I can be about my judgment about where he sits this lunchtime.
Well, I think those who listen to feedback on the repeat on Sundays at 8 o'clock will know whether you've got it right or not. My thanks to Ben Wright and all at BBC Westminster who let us wander where we wanted with no restrictions other than those imposed by the Sergeant-at-Arms. By the way, Martha Carney wants me to tell you that the listening figures for The World at One have never been higher. There, Martha, I've done it. But is it the quantity or the quality? I'd suggest that the feedback audience, which for all I know may well also be reaching unprecedented heights, is particularly intelligent, thoughtful and creative. The proof is that some weeks ago we mentioned on the programme that feedback would like a jingle of its very own. Radio 2 had just unveiled a shiny new set of jingles after all. We've had some wonderful suggestions, and we plan to play them to you over the coming weeks, when we also hope to answer your questions about the dark art of jingle making itself. Here's this week's example.
My name's Alexander Frew. I'm a writer of stories, songs and parodies. I come from the Kilmarnock area and I work as a care assistant. I composed the rap, the feedback rap, because I love listening to feedback and I like the urbane Roger Bolton. I'll be interested to hear your listeners' reactions.
You can criticize, congratulate too. Roger, he will listen to you. Talk about Ambridge or Women's Hour. Feedback's going to give you the power.
Alex, I'm speechless. Goodbye.
'Cause feedback's gonna give you the power. Feedback's going to give you the power. Feedback's gonna give you the power.
By Millbank Prison, which contained a treadmill, inside which inmates walked round and round in circles without getting anywhere. Do the journalists who inhabit it today have a more fruitful occupation? On Wednesday this week, armed with your questions, I joined this network's chief political correspondent, Ben Wright, for the 9:30 a.m. planning meeting.
Good morning, everybody. Just welcome our team from Feedback here, doing a day in the life of Ben Wright. So 20-second package. Fine. Okay, let's talk through the agenda for today. First of all, Prime Minister's question time, which is at noon. Presumably there's two things.
Issued by the Vet Office on behalf of the Egg Timer and Toastal Agency at 0400 hours today.
Apparently the outlook for the next 24 hours is foul. But we begin with politics. The way the BBC reports on the goings-on at Whitehall and Westminster form the basis of a great proportion of our postbag. Here are just a few of the questions you've sent us.
My name's Barry Ruffle. I'm from Shoreham in Sussex. My point is about the free release of politicians' speeches, which are then taken up by news programmes and presented as news items ahead of the speech itself. Seems odd to me that that's regarded as news rather than publicity.
Hello, I'm Jane Creed.
And information. And extracting that information is key to doing the job properly.
Also this week, at a time when the BBC has lots of digital channels, what is cricket still doing on Radio 4 Longwave? And why is it always men playing it?
I noticed that the BBC broadcast the men's final on both Radio 4 Longwave and Radio 5 Sports Extra, whereas the women's final was only broadcast on the digital station, I think it's these sorts of small decisions about where to cover women's sport that collectively add up to the disproportionate coverage.
Listener Claire Martin. And broadcasting has a new cult phenomenon, courtesy of this programme.
And now the chicken forecast.
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello.
So we're going right from one end, the House of Lords end of Parliament, to the other.
What does all this mean? Sources close to the Prime Minister? Number 10 believes that? The Labour leader will say that. How do they know?
We're picking our way through to the press gallery in the BBC office.
In today's feedback, we're going to go behind the scenes in Parliament and try and break that political code with the help of Radio 4's chief political correspondent, Ben Wright.
The currency of this job is gossip.
And I'm calling from Penn in the Chilterns. Many of the stories that we've had have been about financial troubles, and there's a strong overlap between the political implications and the financial ones. And I wonder how the journalists decide who's going to cover what. I suppose I'm really interested in, is there some kind of rivalry?
The BBC's Westminster operation has its office in Millbank, just opposite the Houses of Parliament. There's a team of 12 political correspondents, plus other journalists, producers and technical staff, who provide political news for all the BBC's networks and digital services. The site used to be occupied